Hello, this is Jason here with Divine Frustrations, and the topic that I'm going to be addressing today is involving frustration over Old Testament violence. And that is all of the killings and the wars, and not just things that have happened and been recorded, but things that have actually been sanctioned by God. Instructions provided on utterly destroying communities. And so the person who sent me this emphasized the fact that there are traits that are commonly viewed as being godly responses to conflict, peace and grace and understanding, things like that. But we don't see a lot of that reflected, particularly in the Old Testament. And so there is some concern over why that is. So, this is an age old question. Why does it seem as though God is presented as so vindictive and filled with judgment in the Old Testament? There's so much emphasis on love and grace and mercy in the New Testament. And so, over many years, people have been presenting this particular challenge. And it's also interesting because even in today's class, we were discussing biblical genocides. And so this topic is actually fresh in my mind because of that. So the larger question is, how can we understand some of the things that we read about in the Old Testament in light of the differences or the seeming difference that we see reflected in the New? One of the starting points can be realizing that there is both judgment and mercy in both Old and New Testaments. So even though it may seem as though there are far more acts of judgment and punishment and violence in the Old Testament than there are in the New Testament, there are still elements of both that are presented. I'm going to be sharing a passage at the end that reflects that, particularly the emphasis on mercy in the Old Testament. We see acts of judgment in the New Testament, acts of punishment. If you remember, for instance, in Acts chapter 5 with Ananias and Sapphira, and they were found to be guilty about their dishonesty as far as what they did with what they had sold. And the passage says that they dropped dead in that particular instance. And that was a form of judgment. And that's reflected, of course, in the New Testament. So we see that happening. We also see, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 11, where it says that people were sick and even dying because they were not taking communion seriously. So we do see some of that in the New Testament, but I understand the point of the question because there does seem to be far more instances and more serious instances of it in the Old Testament. So how can we make sense of it? One of the considerations is realizing that there is, to some extent, a different structure in the Old Testament from the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you have God directly involved with his people, ruling over his people, guiding them, directing them, giving them instructions on how to live, what to do, all of the commandments and things like that. So some people have described this as a theocracy, where you have God directly ruling over his people. And as a result, that means he was far more involved in the day-to-day lives and in the matters pertaining to them at that particular time, because that's the way it was. And even with the judges and even with the prophets and, even with the patriarchs, God was still very much involved in the lives of his people and establishing what they were to do. Everything from their release from Egyptian slavery all the way through the establishment of the kingdoms and getting the land that they were promised. So there was much more involvement, and that meant that there was also going to be involvement with other people and other nations who were opposed to the people of God in different respects. And so that's one of the reasons why we see some of the violence directed at a lot of those people, because many of them were opposed to the people of God. And there's a sense in which being opposed to God's people is almost equivalent to being opposed to God himself. And so that would explain one of the reasons why there was a lot of judgment directed at people and a lot of punishment in the Old Testament because of that reality. Another consideration is that there was a different focus as far as the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the Old, the focus was really on establishing the people in their land. Remember the land that was promised to them through Abraham. And so a lot of that was geared towards fulfilling that promise. And when you have a lot of people who are seeking to disrupt the fulfillment of that promise, then that oftentimes is what led to judgment, led to punishment. That was not necessarily the initial response or the initial reaction to punish people or destroy these communities. Um, Building on that thought, I would encourage you to, if you want to look into this further, consider a passage that is found in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 18, verses 7 through 10. And in that passage, you'll see that God is saying that there's a time when he may issue a warning to a nation. If he is planning to bring judgment, destroy it even, and he issues a warning and gives them an opportunity to turn away from their evil. And if they do, then he will not proceed with the destruction. If they do not turn away from it, of course, then the implication is he will proceed with it. So when we think about some of the acts of violence and the judgment that we see oftentimes in the Old Testament, it could very well be because they did not heed the warning that God presented to them as it is communicated in this passage in Jeremiah 18. And so in that case, there's nothing left but to face God's judgment and wrath if a person refuses to turn away from evil. And we even see that reflected in the New Testament, where it says effectively that those who refuse to turn away from evil, refuse to repent, refuse to believe, then there are consequences to that, not only in this life, but in the life to come. So that theme of turning away from evil and experiencing God's mercy versus not turning away from it and experiencing God's judgment, that's reflected in the Old Testament and also well established in the New as well. So that's another consideration, just thinking about the fact that, God has communicated his emphasis on warning people before that comes, and it's up to the individuals how they respond to that. But there is also a consideration, and that is there is a biblical teaching that God is sovereign over all of life, and he alone has the right to give life as well as take it when he decides. And that's a hard reality for many of us to live with, especially when some of those passages involve the killing of women and children, even animals, it says. So, that is a harsh reality, but it is a reality that is consistent with what we understand about the nature of God as the giver of life and also the taker of it. And we can't really dispute that. The main thing we can do, the primary thing, is to embrace it for what it is, be willing to submit to that, and ultimately follow the example of those who are following God's ways so that they are on good terms with God whenever that day comes. So I said a little while ago that there is a passage in the Old Testament that captures the heart of God's mercy and grace, even with the judgment when those times come. And that passage is found in Nehemiah chapter 9. And I would encourage you to read the entire chapter because there it outlines and describes the process. It talks about God's patience. It talks about the way in which God works to prevent certain things from happening and, allowing people to go the wrong way, but still seeking to bring them back. And that's actually a reference to God's people, the Israelites, and just how patient he was with them through all of the rebellion, the idolatry, and all of the evil. But it talks about how he was still there for them, still helping and still bringing them back and would not give up on them because he's gracious and merciful. So I think that there is much more that can be said, a lot of other examples that can be considered, but I think these are some important components to this particular frustration because it is there. We do have to reckon with it. We do see all of these examples of communities being destroyed, innocent victims, collateral damage, and it's all there. But these are some of the considerations that can help us to see this in a different perspective and hopefully still value and appreciate God as he is revealed in both Old Testament and in the New Testament.